Let's tackle now one of the most well-known and debated aspects of the entire lunar discussion, the photographs from the Apollo missions. In order to analyze them in detail, we have turned to the experience of some world-famous photographers who have worked for all the most important magazines in the world. All these photographers were already professionally active in the 1970s, using the same cameras and the same kind of film used by NASA for the Apollo pictures. Let's briefly introduce them. Tony Torenberg, photo reporter, portrait artist, well-known fashion photographer. Starting from the 1970s, he has worked for some of the most prestigious magazines in Italy and around the world. Torenberg has also authored several books on photography and currently runs a photo factory where he regularly teaches photographic technique. His works have been presented in several expositions around the world, including the Biennale of Venezia and the Triennale of Milan. Aldo Falai, world-renowned fashion photographer with more than 40 years of international career under his belt. Starting from the 1980s, he has been the official photographer for Giorgio Armani. With his sophisticated and elegant style, Falai has contributed to creating the fashion image that has defined the Armani trademark across the globe. Falai has published several photography books, and his pictures have been presented in many international exhibitions on his name. Oliviero Toscani, a fashion photographer known all around the globe. From the 1970s, he has literally transformed the concept of fashion pictures with his nonconformist, irreverent style. Besides having worked for all the most important magazines in the world, Toscani has authored some of the most revolutionary advertising campaigns of their times, such as those of Benetton, Fiorucci, and Jesus Jeans. Peter Lindbergh, among the top photographers in the world for 40 years. Lindbergh is credited with launching on the world stage the so-called supermodels, the team of models including Cindy Crawford, Linda Evangelista, Naomi Campbell, Tatiana Patitz, Kate Moss, Christy Turlington, which dominated the fashion scene around the world in the closing decade of the last century. Lindbergh is the only one among the professionals elite to have been asked 3 times to photograph the prestigious Pirelli calendar in 1996, 2002, and in 2017. The favorite personal photographer by many movie stars, from Charlotte Rampling to Penelope Cruz, from Uma Thurman to Nicole Kidman, Lindbergh is considered today simply one of the best living photographers in the world. Also, Massimo Mazzucco, the author of this film, has worked as a fashion photographer for over 20 years, working for important magazines in Italy, United States, Germany, and Australia. Let's now examine the problems related to the type of lighting used for the lunar pictures. There are in fact different elements suggesting that an artificial source, rather than the sun, was used to illuminate the set. This would obviously mean that the pictures were taken on Earth and not on the Moon. The first elements suggesting the use of artificial light are the so-called hot spots. The sun is a huge, extremely powerful source of light, capable of illuminating entire planets with its rays. For this reason, when the sun illuminates a large, flat expanse, the light reaches every visible point with the same intensity. Whether we observe an area closer to us or one in the distance, the luminosity of the ground is practically the same everywhere. This is due to the fact that the sun is thousands of times larger than the Earth, which means it can easily illuminate any portion of its surface with the same intensity. If we use an artificial light source instead, like for example a movie light, the area of illuminated terrain will be much smaller. Furthermore, at the center of the illuminated area, we will see what is called a hot spot, while as we move away from the center, we will notice a substantial decrease of luminosity called fall-off. If we now examine some pictures from the Apollo missions, we will notice the same phenomenon that we saw in the pictures taken with an artificial source. A noticeable hot spot in the center of the image and a just as noticeable drop of light as we move away from the center of the illuminated area. There is no reason why this area should appear darker than this one, this area darker than this one, or this area darker than this one. As we have seen before, when the sun illuminates a large expanse of land, its light reaches every visible point with the same intensity. If we use an artificial light instead, the illuminated area becomes brighter in the center and ever more dark as we move towards the edges. A blatant case of hot spot is found in one of the most famous pictures from NASA. This shot of Buzz Aldrin taken by Neil Armstrong during the Apollo 11 mission. Here the difference on the terrain is already visible to the naked eye, but it becomes absolutely evident for everybody after we increase the contrast. An opinion on this picture was asked of Jan Lundberg, the Hasselblad technician responsible for providing NASA with the cameras for the Apollo missions. When shown the Aldrin picture, Lundberg had to acknowledge, with some embarrassment, that the image seems to have been shot under a movie light, and was unable to provide a valid explanation for that.
Yes, it seems like he's standing in the spotlight. And I can't explain that. That escapes me. Why? So maybe you have to find Armstrong and ask him.
The professional photographers were also very surprised by this noticeable and inexplicable fall-off of light in the distance.
È chiaro che qua c'è una caduta di luce strana. Il sole arriva così, ma è strano che qui sia più buio che lassù, sembra un riflettore messo non centrato bene. Anche qui, che strano, perché sto sorgente luminoso. Sembra ci sia una lampada con attorno un riflettore, tipico delle lampade da studio.
La scurezza della parte scura di qua, della parte in ombra qua, è superiore alla parte in ombra qua.
E non dovrebbe essere.
E non dovrebbe essere uguale.
Qui effettivamente ci si domanda cos'è che crea questa fascia di ombra, perché in teoria è un deserto e quindi...
Sì, anche qui no, perché è più scuro qui, sembra come che... non c'è motivo che queste colline sia, perché il sole è a milioni di chilometri, sì, potrebbe essere lo scuro dovuto, diciamo, al fatto che il sole sta tramontando, è radente, ma è radente, fa delle ombre semmai più lunghe, ma non questo tipo di ombra.
Se fossimo in una sala di posa o se avessimo puntato un grande faro in questa scena, per quanto grande sia il faro, non può mai avere una luminanza come quella naturale del Sole, e quindi per forza si creano delle cadute di luce.
In studio hanno molto senso, in effetti, diciamo, in studio questo è giustificabilissimo, però qui non ha molto senso, dovrebbe essere piattamente, uniformemente illuminato dal Sole. Sì, e le cadute qua sono pazzesche.
It's really funny, that is totally spotlight. But it's totally spotlit, no? It's not like at all a big light coming over there. Yeah, that is funny. You know, that is like totally lit. It's absolutely true. And I know these pictures, I've never thought about it.
Meno è più scuro il terreno in lontananza.
Sì.
E non si capisce perché.
Non si capisce perché.
Il sole dovrebbe illuminare il terreno.
Tutto da tutte le parti, è all'infinito la luce praticamente, no? E sono illuminate queste cose qui, il terreno dovrebbe essere illuminato
come qui.
Infatti. Solito discorso.
Dà la sensazione di uno spot.
Qui, sì. Proprio un sirio, ecco. Un grande sirio.
A sirio, for those who are not professionals, is a large and powerful movie light. And curiously enough, a similar image was obtained in this documentary on the moon landings by using just that, a large movie light. As one can see, the results are very, very similar to those present in the Aldrin picture. According to Paolo Attivissimo, however, there is a different explanation for the fall-off of light in the distance. It would have been the engine of the LEM, he claims, to blow the dust away during the landing, thus revealing the lighter sand underneath.
Non è l'orizzonte del terreno lontano a essere più scuro, è quello il suo colore naturale. è la parte in primo piano che è stata pulita dal getto e quindi ha portato in superficie o ha esposto del materiale più chiaro.
But this hypothesis by Attivismo doesn't hold water for at least two reasons. The first one is that the hotspot phenomenon takes place in different missions and in different situations, some of which are definitely far away from the landing area of the LEM. It is ludicrous to think that the lunar module would have gone around to neatly blow the dust off all these areas before it landed. Secondly, NASA itself denies the fact that the sand under the surface of the moon is lighter than the one on the surface. It is in fact the exact opposite. In this report on the Surveyor missions published in 1969, NASA wrote, "Observations of the fine-grained parts of the lunar surface disturbed by the landing and liftoff of the Surveyor 6 spacecraft have shown that the lunar material exposed at depths no greater than a few millimeters has a significantly lower normal luminance factor than the undisturbed surface. In other words, the ground swept by the lunar module's jet should appear darker than the rest, if anything, and certainly not lighter, like Attivismo says." Another theory put forth by the debunkers to explain the inconsistent illumination of the terrain is the so-called vignetting effect, a phenomenon that sometimes occurs in pictures when the corners of the frame appear darker than the rest of the image. But vignetting is a defect that only occurs in the low-cost lenses, and certainly not in the Zeiss lenses used by Hasselblad, which are simply the best in the world.
Alcuni hanno suggerito che sia un problema di vignettatura, secondo te può esserlo?
No, se l'Hasselblad la vignettatura scherziamo, non la fa. Quindi, fosse una macchinetta da addolire, sì, ma...
Furthermore, several pictures show how the difference between hotspot and fall-off is present in the center of the picture, as in the case of this image reflected in the astronaut's visor. And since vignetting never takes place in the center of the image, we can state with certainty that we are facing a real phenomenon on the ground, and not a case of vignetting.
Stranamente, il sole viene da questa parte e qua è più luminoso, come se arrivasse a illuminare questa zona e meno questa.
This is supposed to come from the sun.
Yes, the sun the sun behind. This is the photographer.
The most ridiculous thing, because there's absolutely no reason that it's darker here and there's thick. It's when you have a spot which is not strong enough.
Right.
Come here, really.
Yeah.
Here's another similar example in which the illumination problem is quite obvious. If we look at the sides of the astronaut photographer, we notice that on the left the ground is brightly lit, while on the right there is a dramatic decrease in luminosity. If this scene were truly illuminated by the sun, this area of the ground would appear as brightly lit as this one. Finally, as a possible explanation, a phenomenon called Heiligenschein has been suggested. It refers to that peculiar halo of light that sometimes appears around the shadow of the photographer in some particular situations. But the Heiligenschein effect only occurs when the sun is located exactly behind the photographer's head, along with the axis of the lens. This is the reason why the halo effect, which is due to a retroreflection phenomenon on the ground, appears all around its shadow. As we have seen instead, many of the hot spots in the NASA pictures occur when the light source is placed on the side of the photographer and not behind his head. Question: given that the sun should illuminate the whole landscape with the same intensity, both close and far away, can you explain the reason for the noticeable fall-off of light seen in many of the Apollo pictures? In this particular case, the fall-off takes place in the center of the frame, thus excluding a vignetting problem, and with the source placed on the side, thus excluding the Heiligenschein effect. Can you explain the reason for the noticeable fall-off of light that can be seen on the terrain right behind the astronaut photographer? Another problem found in certain lunar pictures is the direction of the shadows, which should be parallel to each other had they been generated by the sun, but inexplicably diverge on the ground instead. Because of the enormous distance separating us from the sun, all the shadows generated on Earth by the solar rays are parallel to each other. We can see them parallel, however, converging or diverging, depending on the angle with which we photograph them. If we shoot a picture with the sun behind our shoulders, the shadows will seem to converge as they move away from us. If we take a picture with the sun in front of us instead, the shadows will seem to diverge on the ground. This is due to the phenomenon called perspective. In reality, the shadows created by the sun are always parallel on the ground. We may see them converge or diverge simply because we are photographing them along the vertical axis of the image. If we instead take a picture with the sun at 90 degrees on our side, we will see that the shadows will always appear parallel to one another in all cases. The same thing happens with train tracks, which seem to converge if we shoot them along the vertical axis of the image, but will remain perfectly parallel if we shoot them along the horizontal axis. There are some Apollo pictures, however, where the shadows inexplicably appear to diverge from one another even though the sun is on the side relative to the photographer. This is the most famous example of all. Judging from the lens shadow, the sun is located some 90 degrees to our left. Despite this, the shadows of the rocks in the foreground are not at all parallel to that of the lem, but they clearly diverge from it instead. This is theoretically impossible. As we have seen before, when the sun is on the side, the shadows must be absolutely parallel to each other. If we use an artificial light instead of the sun, and we place it much closer to the objects we are photographing, then the shadows will diverge from each other even though the source remains on the side. This is due to the fact that the closeness of the source creates a strong angle with the objects being photographed. If we use the sun instead, its practically infinite distance makes the shadows appear parallel anyway. Let's go back now to the NASA picture. While these diverging shadows cannot be explained with sunlight, they immediately become justified if we imagine an artificial source placed near the left side of the image. We're talking about a situation akin to this one. This is the set of the television series From the Earth to the Moon. As one can see, the large artificial source imitating the sun, which is placed on the side, produces shadows that are clearly diverging from each other. This is due to the closeness between the source and the objects being photographed. In fact, in the case of the NASA picture, all we need to do is to extend the direction of the shadows backwards, and we'll find that the source is located just outside the left edge of the frame. This obviously cannot be the sun. It must be an artificial light. The Mythbusters have conducted an experiment, trying to find an explanation for the diverging shadows in the NASA picture. First, they created some parallel shadows on the ground. Then they started to modify the topography by inserting holes and mounds until the shadows diverged from each other. But the Mythbusters have made a huge mistake. Instead of using the sun, they themselves used an artificial source, which makes their experiment absolutely null. In the best-case scenario, they have proven nothing at all, while in the worst case, they have just confirmed that NASA also used an artificial source of light like the Mythbusters did. Other debunking sites have tried to offer a similar explanation by showing that in some cases, the roughness of the terrain can generate shadows that seem to go in different directions. But this is not the case with the NASA picture. Here the terrain is practically flat, and all the rocks in the lower part, including the smaller ones, have shadows clearly pointing in the same direction. The point here is not to find different pictures taken on Earth, where the shadows seem to diverge due to the terrain. The point is to explain why in the NASA picture all the shadows lead back to a source that is placed just outside the left edge of the frame, and that obviously cannot be the sun. We have shown the same picture to the professional photographers.
Qui c'è un problema di direzione di ombre, cioè c'è quest'ombra qui che è così e queste qui che sono diagonali così. La domanda qui è, secondo te a che distanza è la sorgente, più o meno? A occhio, cioè, può essere il sole che fa una diagonale?
No, perché il sole essendo lontano non può fare una diagonale. Le ombre devono essere parallele a queste distanze.
Lo giustificano se c'è la fonte è qui, non se la fonte è a milioni, non so di quanta distanza c'è tra il sole e la luna, ma insomma milioni di chilometri, non so. perché a quel punto, a quella distanza, la luce praticamente va nella stessa identica direzione.
Torenberg happens to have a picture in his studio which clarifies exactly the problem we are talking about.
Così sono le ombre del Sole, cioè maledettamente tutte, diciamo, nella stessa identica direzione, perché il Sole, vedi, questo è un Sole al tramonto, no? Molto basso, ma vedi come, voglio dire, nonostante la profondità dell'immagine, cioè l'ombra è assolutamente parallela, non può andare questa di qua e questa cominciare ad aprirsi in questo senso, non ha nessun senso, non può essere. Il Sole è comunque lontanissimo, quindi queste ombre che vanno di qua e questa che va di qua non ha senso, vuol dire che il Sole è qua, cioè a qualche metro di distanza. Oh, guarda.
No, dovrebbe esserci un palo qua.
Se c'è un palo, vabbè, ma se io mi immagino qua un bel crane con un bel ari da 12.000, fa totalmente queste luci qui, cioè quella luce che viene da qua viene qua e quella là va là.
Look at the shadows here and the shadow there. Can this be the...
No, but they're getting worse and worse, I have to say. Look, you have a picture, it's like one shadow comes from here, one shadow comes from here, and there's only one sun apparently.
According to those shadows, where would you place the source, more or less?
It's here on the left. That's very funny. Because the source should be like here, because that would give a light like this, and that would give shadow, this shadow here.
Right.
But only if it's like a pretty close source.
Qui c'è due tipi d'ombre. Questi. Due tipi d'ombre, un'ombra che va per così e un'ombra che va per così. No, è assurda questa. Qui c'è un'illuminazione che viene da questa parte e qui da questa.
Quindi secondo te, giudicando questa foto, dov'è la fonte?
Basta fare così, qui, più o meno qui. A questa altezza, fra l'altro.
Quindi ovviamente non può essere il Sole.
No, il Sole è all'infinito, quindi sono parallele.
Question. When the sun is on the side, all shadows on the ground must appear parallel to each other. Can you explain why in this NASA picture the shadow of the LEM and those of the rocks in foreground appear to be clearly diverging instead? Given that this scene is supposedly lit by the sun, which is millions of miles away, can you explain why the shadows lead to a source that is located not far from the left edge of the image instead? Given that the photographers we interviewed placed the light source a few meters away from the left edge of the frame, can you explain how this could be the sun? There is also another series of images from the Apollo 12 mission suggesting the use of an artificial light. In all these shots, we can notice on the ground the dark shadow of the astronaut who supposedly took the pictures. If we close in on any of these shadows, however, we will notice that they are entirely surrounded by a grayish, blurred kind of edge. This blurred edge in the shadow is absolutely unnatural for having been caused by the sun. Since the sun is millions of miles away, it generates sharp, well-defined shadows on the ground. If you use an artificial light instead, you will get this kind of shadow with soft and blurred edges. Some may suggest that the blurring of the shadow is simply due to a focusing mistake, but this is not the case. If we observe the ground next to the shadow, we will see that it is perfectly in focus, from the closest point to the farthest one. The depth of field here is absolute. This is not a focusing mistake. It's really a kind of light source that generates a blurred shadow on the ground and which therefore cannot be the sun.
If you turn this way and look at the edge, what does that tell you?
I don't know, but it looks very weird.
Could that be the sun? Does the sun cast shadows that soft?
No, because you see the shadows here, they are absolutely tough, no?
Right.
Wow.
No, indubbiamente l'ombra dovrebbe essere più netta, visto che il sole è lontano.
più lontana la sorgente luminosa e più l'ombra è netta,
certo.
Cioè non è sbavata. È stranissimo quest'ombra sbavata.
Più la distanza più la fonte è distante e più le ombre sono nette.
L'ombra dovrebbe essere netta, invece è sfumata, quindi questo c'è un velatino sul sole o su... Ma questo è proprio da incompetenti, chi l'ha fatto, perché il sole fa un'ombra netta. Questa sfumatura è eclatante. Quindi è una lampada.
Question. Being millions of miles away, the sun casts sharp shadows on the ground. Can you explain why, in these pictures, there is a soft edge all around the astronaut's figure instead?